The galactic fear response broke when humans charged screaming into certain death. Part 1. Doctor had studied fear for 300 years. As the Galactic Council's leading expert on survival instincts, he understood how every spacefaring species in the known galaxy responded to mortal danger. The response was always the same, encoded deep in their biology through millions of years of evolution. When death became certain, when the numbers said there was no chance of survival, every intelligent species knew to stop fighting. They would close their 6 eyes and enter a deep meditation, letting their consciousness drift away peacefully. They released chemicals in their brains that made them feel joy and calm, turning their final moments into something like a pleasant dream. The Zenith Collective, beings of pure thought who shared one massive group mind, would simply save copies of themselves and accept the loss of their physical forms. Even the warrior clans of war, who loved battle above all else, would lower their weapons when the math said death was absolute. It was not cowardice. It was wisdom. It was the mark of intelligence itself. This was what believed until the day he met the humans. They arrived at the council station on a small diplomatic vessel, nothing impressive by galactic standards, had been assigned to evaluate them, to run the standard psychological tests that all candidate species had to pass before joining the council. It was routine work. He had done it dozens of times before. The human delegation was led by a woman named Colonel Sarah. She wore a military uniform covered in small colored rectangles that's translator identified as medals and awards. Her face had lines around the eyes and mouth, signs of stress and age. When she smiled at him, noticed it didn't quite reach her eyes. There was something calculating behind that smile, something that made his scales itch with unease. The interview started normally enough. Asked about human history, about their wars and conflicts. Every species had those. What mattered was how they handled the impossible situations, the moments when survival was not an option. "Tell me about your military defeats," said, settling his bulk into the reinforced chair. "The battles where your forces knew they could not win." Colonel's smile changed then. It became something else, something that made evolutionary instincts whisper warnings. "We have many of those stories," she said. "Which would you like to hear first?" She told him about Thermopylae, where 300 warriors held a mountain pass against an army of thousands. They knew reinforcements would not come in time. They knew they would die. They stayed anyway, fighting for 3 days until the last man fell. "But why?" asked, genuinely confused. "What purpose did it serve?" "It gave our people time to prepare," said simply, "and it showed our enemies that we don't break easily." She told him about the Alamo, a small fort where fewer than 200 defenders faced thousands. They were offered chances to leave, to save themselves. Most stayed. They fought until the walls were breached, until they were overwhelmed, until silence fell. She told him about Drift, where 100 soldiers held a supply station against 4,000 warriors. They built walls from bags of corn and biscuit boxes. They fired until their rifles burned their hands. They fought with bayonets when the ammunition ran low. Somehow, impossibly, they won. But's point was clear. They had fought even when winning seemed impossible. She told him about Wake Island, a tiny piece of coral in an ocean, where a few hundred Marines fought an entire invasion fleet. When asked to surrender, their commander sent back a message that simply said, "Send us more Japs." They fought for 2 weeks against overwhelming odds before they were finally overrun. Listen to story after story, each one following the same disturbing pattern. Humans faced with certain death did not seek peace. They did not accept the inevitable. They fought harder. They became more dangerous, not less. "Your species lacks proper fear conditioning," concluded, making notes on his. "This is a serious evolutionary defect. Your survival instinct is broken. When faced with certain death, you should seek to minimize suffering, not increase it through futile resistance." Colonel leaned forward in her chair. "Doctor, our fear response works just fine. We feel fear like anyone else. Our hearts race, our hands shake, our bodies scream at us to run. But we also have something you might not understand. We call it courage. It's not the absence of fear. It's the decision to act despite the fear. That is illogical, said Flatley. Maybe, agreed, but it's kept us alive for a very long time. Wrote his report that night. He recommended conditional acceptance of humanity into the Council, with mandatory psychological oversight. Their broken fear response made them unpredictable, potentially dangerous. But they had technology, resources, and a strange sort of determination that might prove useful. The Council voted to accept them, though several members expressed concerns. That was 3 months ago. Now, as stood on the observation deck of Council Station Prime, watching the sensor displays with growing horror, he wondered if his recommendation had doomed them all. The Devourers had arrived. No one knew where they came from originally. They had appeared at the edge of Council space 2 years ago, a massive swarm of biological ships that moved with single-minded purpose. They consumed everything in their path. 17 civilizations had fallen to them already. 17 species, gone as if they had never existed. What made the Devourers truly terrifying was not their numbers or their weapons. It was their ability to broadcast psionic fear directly into the minds of their prey. When a Devourer swarm attacked, every living being in range felt absolute terror. Not natural fear, not the kind that made you want to run or fight. This was pure existential dread, the certainty of death so complete that resistance became impossible. Victims simply froze, their minds shutting down in self-defense, while the Devourers fed. The Council's defense fleet was the largest ever assembled. 300 warships from 20 different species, representing the combined military might of the galactic government, had felt safe behind such protection. Then the Devourer's vanguard entered sensor range, and the psionic broadcast began. Felt it immediately, a cold weight settling into his brain. His legs wobbled, his vision narrowed. Every instinct he possessed screamed the same message. Death was coming, death was certain, death was inescapable. His species' ancient wisdom took over, preparing him for the end. Around him, he heard the sounds of other council members beginning their shutdown protocols. They started their meditation chants. The scales began to change color as their euphoric compounds released. On the tactical display, watched the fleet stop moving. Every ship, from massive dreadnoughts to small frigates, simply drifted as their crews succumbed to the psionic assault. The Devourers had done this to 17 civilizations before. The math was simple and brutal. Fear was stronger than courage. Biology was stronger than will. Every species in the galaxy knew this truth. Except one. Through the growing fog in his mind, heard a voice on the emergency channel. It was calm, clear, and utterly out of place in this moment of absolute terror. All human vessels, this is Colonel, full combat alert, weapons free, remember what we are. Forced his eyes to focus on the tactical display. The human ships, 5 small vessels at the edge of the fleet formation, were not drifting. They were moving. Their engines flared bright on the sensors. They were accelerating. They were heading toward the Devourers. Impossible, whispered through numb lips. The fear, they should feel it too. But as he watched those 5 human ships pick up speed, driving straight into certain death, realized something that filled him with a terror deeper than any psionic broadcast. The humans did feel the fear. They were charging anyway. Part 2. Captain Maria Santos had been in combat before. She had fought pirates in the outer colonies, had exchanged fire with hostile ships during border disputes, had seen friends die when reactor shielding failed. She knew what fear felt like. It was an old companion, familiar and manageable. This was different. The Devourer's psionic broadcast hit her mind like a physical blow. Her heart hammered so hard she thought it might burst. Her hands shook on the controls of the destroyer Valiant. Every nerve in her body screamed at her to shut down, to give up, to accept the end. Her conscious mind knew the math. 5 human ships against a swarm of thousands. 0.0% chance of survival. Her training took over. "Reactor to maximum output," she ordered, her voice steady despite the terror coursing through her veins. "Divert all non-essential power to engines and weapons. Prep the nuclear package." "Captain," her first officer said, his face pale with sweat, "the tactical computer says we can't win this." "I don't need a computer to tell me that," Santos replied. She felt her lips pull back from her teeth in something that was not quite a smile. "But we're going to make them pay for every meter of space they take." Across the human formation, similar scenes played out. On the carrier Dauntless, Admiral James Park stood on his bridge and felt the fear trying to paralyze him. He was 63 years old. He had back on Earth. He wanted very badly to see them again. The psionic broadcast told him he never would. "Launch all fighters," he ordered. "Every single bird. I want them in the black in 2 minutes." "Sir, the pilots," his operations officer began. "I know," Park said quietly. Tell them it's been an honor." In the fighter bays of the Dauntless, 300 pilots climbed into their craft. They were young, most of them. They had trained for years for combat. They had run simulations. They had learned tactics and strategy, but nothing had prepared them for the weight of absolute certainty pressing down on their minds, the knowledge that they were about to die. Lieutenant Emma Reeves was 24 years old. She had joined the fleet because her father had been a pilot, and his father before him. 3 generations of warriors. As she strapped into her fighter, her hands shaking so badly she could barely work the buckles, she thought about calling home one last time. Then she thought about the 17 civilizations the Devourers had consumed. Billions of lives erased. And she thought about Earth, about her little sister who wanted to be a pilot too, about her mother who made terrible jokes at dinner, about her girlfriend who had made her promise to come home safe. The fear didn't go away, but Emma found something underneath it. Not courage exactly, more like spite. A burning anger at the universe for putting her in this situation, at the Devourers for existing, at the very concept of certain death. If she was going to die, she was going to die fighting. Her fighter launched into the void. Colonel stood on the bridge of her destroyer, indomitable, and watched the Devourer swarm approach on the main display. The psionic fear was crushing, absolute. She could barely breathe. Her vision kept narrowing to tunnel vision. But she had been a Marine for 30 years. She had seen terrible things. She had lost people she loved. Fear was just another enemy to face. "Communications," she called out. "Open channel, all human ships. Let's give them something to remember us by." The comms officer nodded, his fingers dancing across the controls. "Channel open, Colonel." Took a deep breath, then she began to sing. It was an old song, a Marine Corps hymn that dated back hundreds of years. Her voice was rough, not made for music. But other voices joined in, spreading across the human fleet. From the Valiant, from the Dauntless, from every ship and fighter, human voices rose in defiance. From the halls of, to the shores of Tripoli. The Devourers didn't understand music. They didn't have culture or art, but they understood defiance when they heard it. The human ships crossed into weapons range, gave the order, all vessels fire at will. The Indomitable opened up with every weapon she had, spat magnetically accelerated slugs into the swarm, missile pods launched in rippling salvos, energy weapons carved burning lines through space. The Valiant and the other destroyers joined in, creating a wall of fire. It wasn't enough. The Devourers crashed into them like a biological tsunami. Their ships were living things, massive organisms that could regenerate damage, that could split apart and reform, that moved with the coordination of a single mind. They wrapped around the human vessels, their tendrils tearing through armor, their feeding appendages seeking the crew inside. On the observation deck of Council Station Prime, Doctor watched in paralyzed horror. The The psionic fear still held him, but he couldn't look away. The human ships were being torn apart. It was exactly what had happened to 17 other civilizations. The math was playing out as it always did. But then he heard something that made no sense. The humans were screaming. Not screams of terror or pain. These were war cries, primal sounds of rage and defiance that somehow cut through the psionic static. Ancient words in ancient languages. OORAH, for terra, no surrender. Through the hull breach on the Indomitable, Captain saw space and death. Her bridge crew lay dead or dying around her. Her ship was finished, reactor critical, life support gone. She had maybe 30 seconds of consciousness left. She used them well. Her shaking hands entered the override codes. The reactor safety limits disengaged. The magnetic containment began to collapse, but she shaped it, directed it, turned her dying ship into a weapon. The devourers wrapped around the Indomitable, feeding on its structure, never realizing what was happening until it was too late. His last thought was of her daughter back on Earth, safe in school, learning mathematics and history. She hoped someone would tell her that her mother hadn't been afraid at the end. That was a lie, of course, was terrified. But she was also very, very angry. The Indomitable exploded with the force of a small sun. The reactor breach consumed everything within 2 kilometers. 3 massive devourer bioships, each the size of a city, vaporized instantly. Dozens of smaller vessels were torn apart by the shockwave. The explosion carved a hole through the center of the swarm. It didn't stop them, but it made them hesitate. Admiral Park saw sacrifice on his displays. He felt tears on his face. They had served together for 20 years. She had been at his daughter's wedding. Now she was gone and he was next. The Dauntless was being consumed from the inside. Devourer organisms had breached the hull in a dozen places. His crew fought them in the corridors with rifles and blades and bare hands. They were losing. The ship was lost. But Park had one more card to play. "All hands," he announced over the comm. "Abandon ship. You have 3 minutes. This is not a drill." His executive officer stared at him. "Sir." "I said abandon ship, Commander. That's an order. Get the crew out. The fighters can pick them up." "What about you, sir?" Park smiled sadly. "Someone has to stay and steer." The crew evacuated in a chaotic rush, cramming into escape pods and small craft. They left behind their admiral, alone on his bridge, surrounded by advancing devourer organisms. Park sealed the bridge doors and sat down at the helm controls. The carrier was dead, but he could still control the attitude thrusters. He fired them in sequence, turning the massive ship, pointing it at the largest concentration of devourer bioships. Then he pushed the throttle to full. The Dauntless, already dying, picked up speed. It crashed into the devourer formation like a battering ram, its 3-kilometer hull crushing smaller vessels, its momentum carrying it deep into the swarm. Park held course until the devourers finally broke through the bridge doors. As they reached for him, he triggered the self-destruct. Part 3. Lieutenant Emma Reeves flew her fighter through a hell of organic shapes and grasping tendrils. Her craft was damaged, leaking atmosphere, running on emergency power. Half her weapons were offline. The tactical display showed 70% casualties among the human fighters. They had been in combat for 8 minutes. It felt like hours. The psionic fear still hammered at her mind, but Emma had found something strange. The more she fought, the less the fear controlled her. It was still there, making her hands shake and her heart race. But now it felt like fuel instead of poison. Every time she pulled the trigger, every time she dodged another attack, the fear transformed into something else. Rage, pure, burning rage at these things that wanted to eat her, that had destroyed 17 civilizations, that made her feel this terror in her own mind. "Blue 5, I'm hit," her wingman called over the comm. "I'm going down." Emma watched Blue 5's fighter spiral away, trailing fire. She saw the pilot eject, saw the escape pod tumble into the void. A devourer tendril reached for it. "Not today," Emma growled. She dove toward the escape pod, firing everything she had left. Her rounds tore through the tendril. She maneuvered her damaged fighter between the pod and the swarm, providing cover while another pilot swooped in for the rescue. It saved one life, just one out of thousands they had already lost, but Emma found she didn't care about the math anymore. Every life saved was a victory. Every devourer killed was a victory. Every second they delayed the swarm was a victory. The fear told her she was going to die here. She told it to shut up and fired again. Across the battle space, 300 human fighters and the remaining destroyers fought with suicidal determination. They had no hope of winning. The devourers were too many, too resilient, too powerful. But the humans had stopped thinking about winning. They were focused on making the devourers pay. And the devourers were paying. For the first time in their long history of consuming civilizations, the hive mind encountered prey that became more dangerous as they approached death. Usually, species broke when they faced extinction. Their fear paralyzed them. But human fear didn't paralyze. It ignited something primal, something that came from 200,000 years of evolution on a death-world planet, from a species that had climbed to the top of the food chain by being too stubborn to quit. The devourers fed on fear. They had evolved to exploit it, to grow stronger from the terror of their prey. But human fear tasted wrong. It was mixed with aggression and defiance. It contained spite and determination. Every human life they consumed came with a terrible price. Captain Santos watched her crew die around her on the Valiant. The ship was a wreck, half the decks exposed to vacuum, fires burning out of control in the sections that still had atmosphere. She had maybe 2 minutes before the reactor went critical. She thought about her wife and son back on Mars. She thought about the last thing her son had said to her before she shipped out. "Be brave, Mama." "I'm trying, baby," she whispered to the empty bridge. The reactor alarms reached their final crescendo. Santos used her last moments to aim the dying ship at the thickest cluster of devourer bioships she could see. She armed every remaining warhead in the magazines. She disabled every safety protocol. Then she closed her eyes and thought of home. The Valiant joined the Indomitable and the Dauntless in the list of human ships that became bombs. The explosion was brilliant and terrible, a flower of nuclear fire that consumed everything around it. On Council Station Prime, Doctor watched the human fleet die. All 5 ships destroyed, fighter casualties approaching 90%. In military terms, it was an annihilation, a complete defeat. But something was wrong. The devourers were retreating. His mind couldn't process it at first. The psionic fear still clouded his thoughts, though it was beginning to fade now that the swarm was pulling back. He forced himself to focus on the tactical displays. The devourers had won. They had destroyed the human ships. They had killed thousands. But as ran the numbers with his trained analytical mind, he saw something that filled him with awe. The humans had killed millions. 5 small ships and 300 fighters against a swarm of thousands, and the humans had inflicted catastrophic damage. The Devourer Vanguard was a broken thing, its bioships torn apart, its coordination disrupted. And they had learned something their hive mind had never encountered before. Some prey was too expensive to eat. The Devourers had evolved to fight species that broke when faced with certain death. Their entire strategy depended on fear overwhelming resistance. But humans didn't break. They weaponized their fear, turned it into fuel for one last charge, one last fight, one last act of defiance. The math that had served the Devourers for eons had changed. Consuming humanity would cost more than it was worth, and the hive mind, for all its power, understood efficiency. It understood the calculus of survival. The swarm pulling back into deep space, they would not return to Council space. In their collective memory, humanity was reclassified from prey to something else, something dangerous, something that broke the rules. The remaining human fighters, less than 30 out of 300, watched the Devourers leave. Emma Reeves sat in her cockpit, shaking with adrenaline crash, and started to laugh. It was half hysterical, born from stress and exhaustion, and the simple fact that she was still alive when she shouldn't be. "Blue Squadron, form up on me," she called, her voice rough. "Let's go home." The flight back to Council Station was quiet. Emma kept thinking about her wingmen who weren't there anymore, about Admiral Park who had stayed behind, about Colonel's voice singing over the comms, about Captain Santos who had smiled at her once in the corridor and asked how her girlfriend was doing. They had lost so much, 87% casualties, most of the human military presence in Council space gone in less than 20 minutes. But they had won. When the fighters docked, Emma climbed out of her cockpit and collapsed on the hangar deck. Medical teams rushed to help the survivors. Emma waved them off. She wasn't hurt, not physically. She just needed to lie down for a moment and remember how to breathe. Doctor came to the hangar an hour later, after the survivors had been checked over and given medical attention. He found Emma sitting against a wall drinking coffee with shaking hands. Her flight suit was stained with sweat and blood. Her face was pale with exhaustion. "Lieutenant Reeves," he said carefully. His own body was still recovering from the psionic assault. His scales felt tender, his mind foggy. "May I speak with you?" Emma looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much. "Sure, Doc, have a seat." Settled down beside her, his bulk making the simple action awkward. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the recovery teams work on the damaged fighters. "I don't understand," finally said. "You felt the fear, I know you did. The psionic broadcast should have paralyzed you like it paralyzed us, but you fought anyway. You charged toward certain death. Why?" Emma took a long drink of her coffee. "You want the scientific answer or the human answer?" "Both." Scientifically, our fear response evolved differently. We came from a world where standing still meant death, where the predators were faster than us, stronger than us. So we learned to fight when we were afraid, to run when we were afraid, to do anything except freeze. She paused. "But that's not really why we did it." "Then why?" Emma turned to look at him with those old eyes in her young face. "Because someone had to. Because if we didn't, those things would have killed everyone on the station. Because we're scared, Doc. We're terrified. But we're also really, really stubborn. And we figured that if we were going to die anyway, we might as well make it count." Processed this for a long moment. "That is not logical." "No," Emma agreed, "but it's human." The council meeting that followed was unlike any in galactic history. Representatives from every member species gathered to discuss what they had witnessed. The holographic recordings of the battle played on endless loop. Analysts pored over the data, trying to understand how 5 ships had changed the outcome of an unwinnable fight. Commander James Torres represented humanity. He had been on one of the destroyers, had lost his left arm when a devourer tendril tore through his station. He stood before the council with his injury wrapped in clean bandages and spoke in a quiet, firm voice. "We lost a lot of people today," he said. "Good people, heroes. They knew they were going to die, they were terrified. But they also knew that their deaths would buy time for the rest of the fleet to recover, to prepare. They made that trade willingly." "Your fear response is broken," one council member stated. It wasn't an accusation, just a confused observation. Torres shook his head. "Our fear response works fine. We feel everything you feel. Our hearts race. Our hands shake. Our bodies scream at us to run or hide. But we also have something else. We have the ability to say no to that fear, to acknowledge it, feel it, and then act anyway. Not because we're unafraid, because we're afraid of the right things." "What do you fear?" asked from his seat. Torres met his eyes. "We fear failing the people who depend on us. We fear letting evil win because we weren't brave enough to stand up. We fear living as cowards more than we fear dying as warriors." He paused. "And yeah, we fear the same things you do: pain, death, loss. But we've learned that sometimes those fears matter less than other things, like duty, like honor, like making sure the people we love are safe." The council voted that night. Humanity's application for full membership was approved unanimously. Several members admitted it was partly because they were afraid to have humans as enemies, but mostly it was because they had seen what humans did when faced with certain death. They charged anyway. In the weeks that followed, the galaxy's textbooks were rewritten. A new category was added to describe the human response to mortal danger. They called it defiant action syndrome in the academic papers. The clinical description talked about neurotransmitters and evolutionary advantages and statistical analysis. But the soldiers and the survivors had their own name for it. They called it being human. Emma Reeves was promoted to captain and given command of a new fighter squadron. On the first day of training, she stood before her pilots, a mix of humans and, surprisingly, volunteers from other council species, and told them about the battle. "Fear is natural," she said. "Fear keeps you alive. Fear makes you check your systems twice, makes you watch your six, makes you come home safe. Never ignore fear, but also never let it control you. Because sometimes the scariest thing you can do is exactly what needs to be done." One of the alien pilots raised a tentacle. "Captain, how do we learn this? How do we fight when our bodies tell us to stop?" Emma smiled, and it was the same smile Colonel had given Doctor months ago. A smile that didn't quite reach the eyes, that hid something fierce underneath. "You practice," she said simply. "You train until the reactions become automatic. You stand beside people you trust who will stand beside you. And when the moment comes, when every nerve in your body is screaming at you to give up, you think about what matters more than your fear. Maybe it's your family. Maybe it's your planet. Maybe it's just spite, the refusal to let the universe win." She looked around the room at all those young faces, human and alien alike. "And then you charge anyway, screaming optional but highly recommended." Doctor wrote his final report on human psychology 3 months after the battle. He had spent the time interviewing survivors, reviewing data, trying to understand what made humanity different. His conclusion was simple and profound. "The human fear response is not broken," he wrote. "It is, in fact, perfectly functional. Humans feel fear as acutely as any species in the galaxy. The difference lies not in the fear itself, but in what humans do with it. Where other species view fear as a master to obey, humans view it as information to consider. They can acknowledge mortal terror and still choose to act. This is not a defect. This is perhaps the most dangerous evolutionary advantage in the known galaxy." He paused in his writing, remembering the sight of those 5 human ships accelerating towards certain death while their crews screamed defiance. Remembering how the Devourers, apex predators of the galaxy, had fled from prey that refused to die quietly. Added one final note to his report: recommendation to Council: never give humanity a reason to view us as enemies, not because they are unafraid, but because they are afraid and will charge anyway. The report was filed and studied and became required reading for every military academy in Council space. But the real lesson of that day spread in a different way, through stories told by soldiers and survivors, through legends that grew with each retelling. The Devourers never returned to Council space. They hunted in other parts of the galaxy, far from human territory. In their hive memory, in the collective knowledge they passed through generations, humanity held a unique classification. They weren't prey, they weren't predators, they were something the galaxy had never seen before. They were the species that looked at certain death, felt the appropriate fear, and decided that dying well was more important than dying peacefully. They were the species whose fear response had broken not through absence, but through transformation. They were the species that charged screaming into the dark, not because they couldn't feel fear, but because they could feel it and fight anyway. They were human, and the galaxy would never be quite the same.